Just as I said this morning that there is quite a lot of influence from the European Romantic movement into our contemporary understanding of Buddhism, there's also quite a lot of influence from the psychotherapeutic and psychoanalytical traditions. They're part of our culture. It's really hard to step outside of that completely. And there's a lot of virtue in that, and it has its place. I also think it sometimes complicates something about the practice and what we're talking about relating to identifying, to thinking, to solving problems, is that we try to work it out, just through the practice I will resolve it. I will find the right thought that will finally make everything clear. Because Buddhism is about understanding, right? And inevitably we think, we have to understand who we are, and we have to understand this thing and find out. And there's that philosophical maxim from Greece, that know thyself, right? We need to. At the same time, it's impossible to not interpret some of these messages from our culture and our time. So what know thyself might have meant to a person in ancient Greece before Freud, before the scientific revolution, before, it's probably not the same as what it means for us today to know thyself. So I like to make a link here to the Japanese Zen Buddhist Dogen, the famous founder of the Soto school in Japan, who said that to study the way is to study the self. So far it feels resonant, But then the next sentence says, to study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be awakened by all things. And I find that very interesting. To study the self is to forget the self. Paradoxically, if we want to know how this thing works, maybe we have to set aside all the stories and all the discourses we have about it. Not that none of them is useful in some regards, but we also need that skill to not latch onto these stories. Another way to put this is that the practice is not about you. The practice is not about you. You can get out of the way. You're not that important. Just sit, and it's about the breath. And yes, it's about aversion and kindness, but in themselves, it's not about you. I find that a challenging and yet really appealing message. It's not about me. Because due to our conditioning and what I said about psychoanalysis, we can turn this practice too into a discourse building activity. Right? So it becomes a quest for insights, a quest for psychological insights. Oh, I've seen that pattern now. And I know where it comes from because when I was a kid, etc. It's very hard to find this kind of language in Asian Buddhism, in traditional Asian Buddhism. That's something. I'm not saying that this is particularly good. Sometimes it's not. But a characteristic of traditional Asian teachers is that they're not very interested in your biography. And I think sometimes, that could use a little bit of. But it also had something good. It's like, no, talk to me about the practice, not what happened to you when you were a child. And it's like, I mean, this has a place, but it's different. It's a different kind of exercise. And if we merge them, we also lose the distinctiveness of each and some of the liberating potential of forgetting ourselves. Like, it's not all about me. And maybe awakening is not the same as psychoanalytical healing, or it's not the same. I don't fully know what awakening is. I mean, I can reflect about it. But every now and then you go, but it's not that. You know, it's different. Some psychological growth, which is a great thing, and some psychological insights are not always the same as the freedom that we get from this practice. Sometimes these things overlap, and sometimes they don't. We can get trapped into the quest for psychological insights. We can get trapped into stories that... Have you ever had that experience where you go on retreat, especially happens on retreat, and you have kind of scripted your own insights? It's like, yeah, I'm going to discover that, you know. And so you start discovering things that are not really new. You had prepared your insides. So so we have this quest for psychological insights, and this may or may not be liberating. Because we can just start to build another kind of self. And then it also helps that behavior I mentioned in the morning of starting to analyze what having a certain thought or feeling means about me. And it becomes a sort of self-centered kind of activity. Oh, I had this thought, oh no, then that means I'm a bad meditator, or I'm such an aversive person, I'm always afraid. And we, instead of gaining some freedom from this, we just go even deeper into it. And I think it is particularly obvious in some ways that this practice is presented. You know, the idea of Vipassana, of seeing deeply, of seeing clearly, can become, and I think that's a misunderstanding, can become this quest for personal insights, which are discursive and are about me and the things we discover, patterns. And whereas traditionally, this is preceded by samatha, by pacifying the mind. As I said, this finding a resolution of conflict and tension. And that's not about discourse. That's about finding a little bit of peace. And so one way to understand this is that one of the things we do in practice is learn how to resolve all this activity going on, thoughts, feelings, but not resolve through working it out, but finding an embodied resolution, kind of stop fighting. That might be a way to put it. To stop fighting, to find peace, to stop the struggle, and then reach that deal. And when we pacify a conflict, when we resolve a conflict, that's the origin of the word samatha. And then, once we've taught the mind to find a place of safety, of calm, of well-being, a place which is not reactive, a place, that's not through aversion, through craving, attachments, or discursive confusion. When we get the mind into that state, even if temporarily, the other side of the coin is, okay, how did we get there? And that's the Vipassana, that's the understanding. Now, the mind was very reactive, he was wanting this, not wanting that, all running around. And I got it to a state of more peace. How did that happen? And then through doing this again and again, to see, well, what things lead to that peace and what things do not and lead to more agitation. So that's the understanding, and it's pretty universal. So of course there's particularities with each person. Not everything works the same way for everyone. But it's not so much about our biography. It's just seeing how the mind works. Another way to understand Vipassana is that once we have pacified the mind, got the mind into a non-reactive space, then we see from that pacified state. And things look different from a pacified state. Conflicts in the world and in oneself look different. We're able to see the fuller picture, perhaps a more balanced view of things. Without that pacification, easily we just encourage more autobiographical rumination within the practice. Who am I? Who am I not? And that's a little bit the trick in the title of today's workshop. You really ain't your thoughts. And then, of course, the question, as someone mentioned, is, well, then who am I? Is that a useful question, though? Is that the point? So, if you go to the early Buddhist texts, you will find that there's a lot of talk about I am this, I am not that. The Buddha reflected and taught about this idea of self and encouraged people to relate to experiences from a perspective of this is not mine, this is not who I am, this is not my essence. But that has to be understood just as not doing the opposite. I'll explain. As not doing the action of regarding this is mine, this is who I am, this is my essence. Because the Buddha discouraged people not only from declaring that this is who I am, this is the self, it exists, it's this and that, but also against saying the self doesn't exist, it's not here, it's that, which leaves you thinking, well, then what's the alternative? If the self exists, it's in my patterns, or it contains patterns, if that is wrong, if that's a wrong view, but also the self doesn't exist is also a wrong view, what option is left? The option is not to do any of that activity, to not think in those terms. To me, not self is a practice, it's not a theory. It's not a theory about what exists or doesn't exist, it's a practice. It's to realize that we do the action of thinking in terms of self. I am this, I am not that. I identify the act, the behavior, often unconscious and automatic, but the behavior nonetheless of identifying with things, which entails a belief in control. When I say this is mine, it's not just that it's geographically close to me, like this is my iPad and it's not your iPad. What does it mean that this is my iPad? That I have it? No, because I could give you my iPad and you would have it, but it would be my iPad. So what's the difference? Well, if it's my iPad, you can't just really go out and sell it to someone else or throw it out the window and break it, because it's not yours. But I can go and sell my iPad. I can break it if I want to. Usually the idea of ownership is the idea that you have or should have control over something. If it is mine, I can choose what to do with it. If it's not, I'll have to ask permission. Yeah. So when we say this is mine, a lot of the times there's that, how to say, an assumption, or an unspoken assumption, or ambition that I have control over it. And when we say this is who I am, or this is what I am, we're identifying or we're defining ourselves in a particular way, which means we're limiting ourselves and freezing ourselves. If this is what I am, means I'm not other things, and if this changes, then who am I anymore, and am I still me? And all that activity is about the self. And the Buddha is suggesting, don't do that action of identifying, of regarding something as yours, as what you are. But you do not need to then claim whether the self exists or doesn't, or what you are not. Just don't do the activity. The self exists, no need to do that. It doesn't exist, no need to do that. It's still about thinking in terms of self. You're still in the middle of all the things. Just get out. I'm not saying this is easy, but that's a practice. You see a thought, you don't need to go, oh yeah, this defines me. I was like, no, I should not be having these thoughts. I was like, just don't do it. Just go, in breath, out breath. I think it was Ken MacLeod, a teacher, who had an article in Tricycle magazine. I think it's there. And there was this slogan that I really liked, and it stayed with me. It says, you don't need to know who you are in order to bloom. And I really liked that. You don't need to know who you are in order to bloom. It suggests that there is or there can be a transformation or a process that does not depend on you having the right concept and description of who or what you are or are not. Because it's not about that. And that's the practice of the middle way as well. Not saying yes, not saying no. The point is not who we are or what we are. Part of the point is to see how we identify with things. That's a behavior. And so you may know that teaching of the 5 bundles of clinging, usually translated beautifully as the 5 aggregates. Okay, forms and appearances and body. Okay, it's kind of easier to say, yeah, sure, I'm not my stomach, I'm not my knee pain, okay, I don't identify with that, my body doesn't just follow my orders, sure. And then it starts to going into your feelings and your patterns, and it gets, as you move through the 5 bundles, if you know, the first one is appearances and forms and body, the second one is feelings in terms of happiness and suffering and pain and pleasure. Then you go to perceptions, the way that we conceptualize things, we put labels on things. That's also not who we are. That's also conditioned by culture, by all sorts of things. So it's not really up to us. And then you go into patterns, and finally consciousness. And that's the last one, because obviously it's the hardest one not to identify with. You're like, okay, I'm not the content of my thoughts, but I'm the observer. I'm awareness itself. Are you? And what would that mean? I don't know. There's many traditions that end up there. Like, I'm awareness, and that might be, in some sense, like comparatively, a better view than thinking of ourselves very restrictively as one specific thought that I have every day when I wake up or whatever. But still, do we need to affirm that we are awareness or not? Why? So it's not about who we are. It's about what do we decide to construct or not. What do we decide to follow and strengthen, and feed and what not. And that's what counts. At least that's how I try to see and practice the Dharma. To say, okay, is this kindness and understanding and fairness, for example? Okay, then let it be here. Dwell in it, And if you see what allows it to linger on a bit more, then allow it. If you realize what kills it, then okay, be aware of that so that you don't feed that. And that's what matters. We don't need to make this into a self and who I am. This is a normal and yet kind of optional activity. It's an optional activity, but it's very automatic. And so, curiously, we take a lot of responsibility for what pops into our mind, right? And and if it's not very nice, then we start berating ourselves. But then the act of, for example, ruminating, of taking a thought and like mulling over it again and again and again, which is an action, which is a choice, even though it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes we don't take responsibility for that. It's like, oh, it just happens on its own. It's automatic. Is it? That's thinking. We take a thought that happens, like a sound. We take the prompt, we take the bait, and then we engage in something. It's very automatic because we're very used to doing that. But it is an action that we are doing in a way. And so we start to see, when do I want to do this? With what kind of thoughts? So maybe I'm a complete failure, okay? I don't know if you've ever had that thought. It might be true, it might be false. I don't know how I would go about and prove it. I don't think there's any objective standards to see, am I a failure? And one of those things like, do you do this? Yes, no. Those charts, and then you follow to see. But what happens if I feed the thought I am failure? And by feeding, I mean either agreeing with it or trying to refute it, just like engage with it. Just going to be in this fight, It's going to get bigger. Last week, I was teaching a retreat, and before we started, we were preparing the hall. Someone mentioned that they had gone to a retreat with another teacher, who is a very good friend of mine, actually. And they said, but this he talks way too much. He talked all the way through the retreat. We barely had any meditation, and was saying that as a negative thing. And there was a little kind of liking in me when I heard that. It's like, I'm going to speak once in the morning and once in the evening. It's going to be a lot of silence in this retreat, which I consider a good thing, So it was a silent win for myself. But I didn't give it a lot of importance. It was that moment that felt kind of candy, That felt like candy. And then later at night, when I was lying down to sleep, then I discovered the mind going back to that and starting to sort of like enjoy that thing and kind of like, oh yeah. And when I saw that, I could have gone and continued that thought and emphasized, yes, that other teacher, whatever, and me. Or I could have gone, how can you be so conceited, and blah, 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 blah. We would have been equally a way to engage with that, about who I am or am I not, and blah, blah, blah. So I consider that an unskillful, clumsy thought. One that I would prefer not to have, and I don't want to feed it. But when I discover it is happening, the really radical thing is to not do anything about it. To go, and that's it. It's really, I don't know if it's hard or not, because in one sense it's really simple. Because it's the most minimalist thing you could do. You don't do anything with it. You don't even say like, why did I? No. At the same time, it's very difficult to do that because we're not used to. We're always used to doing something about it. But that's a practice. It's not about what a wonderful or horrible person I am because I was enjoying that thought. It's about, in the moment, you see, is this something useful? Is this something aligned with my values and what I want to construct, in a way? What I want to build as a character, and the impact that things have and the qualities that I value in and of themselves. Yes or no? And then you either take care of it and nurture it, or you don't. You don't need to actively kill most of the times. You just don't feed. That's what not clinging means, really. Clinging is also a metaphor for feeding a fire, because basically the flame clings to its fuel. So that you're keeping something alive. So you just stop fueling the flames, and then when whatever fuel is there runs out, the flame will go out. So we're not responsible for what pops into our mind, but we are responsible for what we do with it. So we take it up and then agreeing, disagreeing, arguing, refuting, agreeing, continuing it. And whenever we see that activity, we stop. We stop contributing. And that's all. We cannot undo even any millisecond of what we have been engaging with. But we can not engage for the next millisecond. So, just a couple of reflections from the Buddha about what is helpful, what is not helpful. It might help you to recognize that there is a text where the Buddha says that when he was practicing, he had thoughts during his meditation. And what he decided to do is sort of to classify those thoughts into two categories. It's a little bit like what I said this morning about seeing the general type of thought rather than getting bogged down in details of the storyline. And so he classified, thoughts that were helpful and those that were not. Now the text gives you a specific criteria, kind of like which are the helpful thoughts and which are not. And the helpful thoughts are about non-desire, about renunciation, about compassion, and about non-cruelty. And the unhelpful or unskillful thoughts are those that are about sensory desire and cruelty and harming. Now that's the answer from that text. But what I'm more interested in actually is the questions that the Buddha poses to then determine the thoughts. Because maybe we have a list and it's not the same as the list of the historical Buddha. But the question he asks is, does this lead to more conflict or less? Does it harm others, myself, and both? Does it harm the relationship? Does it feed reactive patterns or not? Does it increase greed, aversion, confusion or does it not feed? So these are the main criteria. Does it harm others, myself, and both? Does it increase or decrease reactivity? Does it lead to conflict or less conflict? And then we can see. And it's sometimes we have to try things out and go, oops, that increased conflict. And we see that repeatedly, and we get a almost palpable sense of that. So that when certain things appear and we practice withdrawing our contribution to that, we can start having other options. But the point of realizing that we're not our thoughts is not really about any reflection of who we are or are not. The point is the practice of not needing to identify with all the content of our experience so we can have choice. And I think choice is more important. What we choose to do with what happens in our experience. Maybe for some people it's helpful to think that this is who I am, my choices. And a lot of the teaching of karma is about that. What counts is the choices you make. But that might not be helpful for somebody. So it doesn't really matter who I am, or because whatever answer I come up with is an abstraction from many experiences. You don't need to know who you are in order to bloom.